Hey guys, it's Nicole and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to talk about Zygopetalum orchids. So I don't have too many of them. This is actually the only Zygo that I own, but I love their beautiful flowers. They have some gorgeous blue, purple, and brown flowers, and the variety is just amazing. So today I'm going to talk to you guys how I care for this orchid. This one is the Zygopetalum Blue Blazes crossed with the Arthur L. York. So this is a really nice one I got from Hauserman's. And this video is a collaboration with several YouTubers, which I will link down below. We all have a different way that we care for these orchids. Some folks grow this orchid semi-hydroponically. Personally, I'm growing it in organic, and I'll share why. But we all care for this a little bit different, so check everybody's video out. So let's jump right into the history of this orchid. I got this back in September of 2020. It was a seedling orchid, but it's growing very quickly for me. When I received it, I was told it was 1 to 2 years from blooming. So I got it pretty much as a seedling, and now it is, I'd say, probably sort of near blooming size. This orchid arrived in a 2-inch pot. I repotted it. I made a video on it, which I'll link down below. The root system is very vigorous. So these zygopetalums have very, very strong root systems. With that being said, though, something that I've actually learned from Michael McCarthy is that these orchids, the roots, if you damage them, the root can die. So you have to be very careful. The roots are quite vigorous, but they're very sensitive. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind with Zygopetalum orchids. I've also learned a lot about these with Roger orchids. He did a lot of content with Zygos, and between him and Michael McCarthy, I feel like I've learned a great deal of how to care for them. So as I said, I got this orchid as a seedling, and I repotted it just a few weeks ago. So this is in a brand new pot. When I repotted it back in September, October after I received it, I was really careful with the root system. I put it in a mixture of sphagnum moss and bark, and within 6 months, it just completely took over the pot. And I will show you what that looks like with pictures. But it completely, within 6 months, it completely filled the pot with roots. So I knew it was happy. I ended up, because it was in active growth and it's still a pretty young orchid, I did not want to mess with that root system. So what I did was I took off maybe the top layer of bark, things that were not touching the roots, and I just plopped it into this larger 5-inch pot. I put moss and bark around it and went on my way. So that still has the old medium on it and new fresh bark and sphagnum moss. And that old stuff that was on it is not even that old because it's not even a year old. So hopefully this can last here for another year, perhaps maybe even 2 years, who knows with this orchid. But ultimately it's a mixture of bark and moss, and I'm just super careful with it because I don't want to damage or bruise any of those roots, and I don't want to set this back whatsoever. I have not attempted to move this to semi-hydroponics just because I did initially pot it in bark, and I did not want to bruise the orchid. Now, if I would have had it potted 100% in sphagnum moss, I probably would have considered it, but I can try later when this orchid is larger. And as I mentioned, this is my only Zygo, and I don't like to move things into semi-hydro unless I've felt like I've mastered how to grow them in organic and I know how they react. So that's my thinking there. Now this particular orchid is grown 100% under lights. I try to avoid getting water on the leaves just because I know that a lot of folks get damage on the leaves when they splash water on them. This orchid does not have too much spotting. It's very, very light, but I find that the leaves are quite almost pristine. It does have a little spotting, you can barely tell, but overall the leaves are quite spotless, and I try to avoid getting water on them. I have wiped them though to get dust off with a moist towel, and it did not have any detrimental effects. In terms of feeding this orchid, I feed it just like I do all of my other orchids. I give it around 100 to 150 parts per million of MSU fertilizer and some Super Thrive. Sometimes I will supplement that with a tiny bit more CalMag, but I make sure that I cap it at about 100 to 150 parts per million in the winter, and then I ramp that up to about 300 to 350 parts per million in the summer. I've even been known to go slightly higher. I play it by ear. I don't care if it's perfect. I've even fed 400, 500 parts per million. It's not a big deal to me. They'll grow, they'll take it, and they'll do well with it. Now, what I find super important with these orchids is that I flush them thoroughly. Everything that's in an organic setup, they get flushed once a month extremely thoroughly. This has a lot of moss in it, and the moss will tend to hold on to those nutrients, so I will make sure that it's under a strong tap water and just completely drenching through for at least a minute. And that's how I do it with all of the organic setups, especially things in moss. I make sure that there's plenty of water flowing through very abundantly. This is grown under moderate LED lights, and it's doing quite well. I don't have it under Cattleya-like lights, but I have it in more of an Oncidium type setup. And I find that the growths come in first, and then they develop a bulb later. And so far it's pushing out a couple of new growths already, which is right here. And in terms of troubleshooting this orchid, I actually did have some trouble a couple of months ago where I noticed a lot of the leaves were dropping. And that's when I decided to repot it, and it is doing so much better. So I came to the conclusion that it dropped leaves because I wasn't able to keep up with the watering. So as I mentioned, it was in a 4-inch pot, and that 4-inch pot was taken over by roots and just sucking up all of the moisture dry. I was watering every other day, and it still wasn't enough. But when I was able to pot this up into a larger pot, I have no issues any longer. So I find that these orchids do like their moisture, so I make sure to give it plenty of water. So we spoke about how I feed this orchid, the lighting situation. I also have a fan running so that it's constantly getting a strong source of air. Other than that, I really hope that this orchid can bloom for me in another year or so. I'm pretty sure it will. It's so much larger than when I first got it as a seedling. I haven't had it even quite for a year, but I really look forward to the beautiful blooms. Well, anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. Be sure to check out the other videos on this collaboration down below, and I'll talk to you guys soon. Bye.